So most of you are probably very similar to the age of the team that I lead at the Tylt. Many of the young journalists we have, young creators we have, are early to mid-20s. They are some of the best people I've ever worked with in a long career. And it's so long sometimes I tell them about it and I put them to sleep. But they still listen, which is kind of nice of them. And so we'll go back a little bit before we get to what it is that I do now. So I'm pretty lucky that I came along in journalism when journalism was just so freaking hot. The 90s were sort of a rock and roll time for journalism. Papers were flush with money. The industry was doing amazing things. There was this thing called classified advertising, which was the bedrock of the newspaper business. And for somebody like myself, coming from a very small town in North Florida, where you grew up in a little town, Live Oak, Florida, which had like a burger joint and a chicken joint. And you go to college at Auburn on a Taco Bell budget, so that was a lot of what we had there. So going into the newspaper business was pretty eye-opening to me, because I started out in places like the Tampa Tribune, where Chris and I were, and places like the Orlando Sentinel, which back then, in the early 90s, I was lucky enough to be the beat writer for the Orlando Magic. So Shaquille O'Neal was the rookie coming into town and doing all sorts of amazing things in basketball. And it was a really great time to cover the NBA. Sort of that era where Michael was still going strong, the young guys were coming in, and it really was a reflection of the newspaper industry. When I was going to games back then, the little girl from Live Oak, Florida was suddenly traveling with the teams. Back then we traveled with the teams. We would go to and stay at the hotels where they stayed. So the newspaper business was doing so well that very often we would travel to the teams, with the teams. We would stay in the same hotels, and often those were the Ritz-Carltons. So you can imagine, from somebody who grew up eating chicken and burgers, going to the Ritz-Carlton was a pretty big deal. But it just shows you how the industry was doing so well, and that everything seemed to be paved with gold back then. And it carried on for quite a while. It went on to Minneapolis and then the New York Times, and I can remember the New York Times. Things were so good that we would routinely be taken out to these big fancy dinners just to meet at night with the team and to talk. And when I would cover events like the French Open, we'd call the travel agent, and the next thing you know, we were booked into a 5-star hotel in Paris. So it was crazy, right? It was really crazy, and then almost overnight, right? And it was in the early 2000s, almost overnight, we went from booking the 5-star hotel to Courtyard Marriott, right? So the next thing you know, things have changed dramatically because the internet came along. So it wasn't about losing access to all the fancy stuff. It was about losing journalism itself, because the life was being bled out of it. The money was drying up. What we saw even today in the news with McClatchy filing for bankruptcy and really pulling the rug out of print journalism in a big way. Those kind of things are, happening at rapid pace, but it really was a tipping point in the early 2000s when several things happened, so many things that you look back, you think, why didn't somebody stop that? Well, we started giving away news for free in the early 2000s. We started to be a little entitled about what was next, like, well, we can replace the fact that we're giving away for free with online advertising. Well, then Facebook and Google came along and hoovered up all the money from advertising. So you can see where the industry just couldn't handle it. The industry did not handle digital coming along. And most of you are, like the folks I work with, digital natives. This is all you know. All you know is growing up on digital. And I think what's so cool about it is that you're not freighted with the past in so many ways. There are some great things about the past that were great. But what you've learned now is to be a reflection of the folks that work for me, and that is you probably know everything about social. You probably know everything about maybe cutting your own video. You may know about how to make memes to go with the tweets, to socialize the content you develop. Some of you may be filmmakers. I think so often we look at the industry now and we think, what the heck happened to it? And those are the people who look like me. Like the people who are 50 who say, what happened? You guys don't know that, and that's good because you don't need to know what happened. You need to know what's next, right? And how good journalism can still be. No doubt that I worry about it all the time, right? I look at kind of what's happening today in journalism and I think, you know, wow, people seem lost, right? They seem forever lost. There was a time when I felt lost, so I left the business. I left it in 2012 to start the streaming service, kind of walking out on it thinking, you know, I just don't fit in anymore. There's not the resources to do investigative reporting. I couldn't have done the story on Alex Rodriguez when I left because when I was there and did it, we had the resources to do it. I could go to Miami and spend a lot of time talking to people and get the right story. Same thing when I broke the Lance Armstrong story. I could go to places and talk to people and get the real story. Those resources started drying up. There really was nowhere left for me to go. So I started my own thing. I started a production company, I started a streaming service, and I just wanted to tell stories a different way. So along the way, I started missing it. I started missing that sort of drama of the everyday. I started missing the beat of what's going on and being involved, but I damn sure didn't want to go back to the same old, right? I didn't want to go back to newspapers, not in the way that I left the print business. I felt like there had to be something else, right? So I kind of was looking. Producing films and writing for TV, it's great, but you have a lot of time where you're waiting for the next thing. And even though you can do really well at it, you're a lot of times thinking about what should I be doing right now. So I was a little bit lost for about a year. A friend of mine said, you know, if you feel like you want to get back in, but not back in the same way, there's this place called the Tylt. They're doing some interesting things. And I had never heard of the Tylt. I did not know what it was. And I started looking at it, I started thinking about it, and I started thinking, okay, maybe this is a good place to go. Maybe this is a place where I can sort of like reinvent a little bit. And the fact is, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. And I mean, in a career of really good things, this is the best thing. And right now, so I'll show you a little bit about what the Tylt is.
It all starts with a question. Every vote is a voice telling a story. We measure consumer sentiment as the heartbeat of our storytelling to help you understand your audience better. Every minute across site and social, we spark impactful debates, allowing you to own the conversation where your audience is already engaged. We listen to a young generation wanting to be heard. That's the core of our creative studio. We are the Tylt. We are journalists, designers, data scientists, and filmmakers. We reflect what matters most to Gen Z and millennials. Food, culture, sports, and entertainment. Our creative team puts clients in the middle of the conversation, and our branded content lives on after a debate. Use our signal algorithm to gather data in real time. We get your audience. We get results no matter the question. Work with the Tylt and find out what your audience cares about.
So that is a little bit of what the Tylt is. It is a social polling platform that really does fuel our storytelling. We really do listen to people, and you would think that's kind of a natural thing in journalism, right? We ask a lot of questions every day. We ask them mostly to Gen Z millennials, and we gather that information. We have touch points that you can vote on. We have an algorithm that traces those votes around the internet through hashtags as votes, on our site as voting, and we collect a ton of votes, 120 million votes just last year. So you think that's a lot of information, and they've been doing it for almost 4 years now. So what do you do with that information? What do you listen to? What are you trying to gain out of that, right? So in so many ways, the one thing I've discovered working there is that it's a better form of journalism. And I'll explain that a little bit, in that the old way is the way I grew up on, right? Which is, very often you're in a newsroom and you have a story moment where you're gathered with editors and you find the story and you're trying to figure out what is the story of the day, what is going on in this story, right? And I can tell you that one example of this came when I was working at the New York Times, and we were preparing to cover the Olympics after 9/11. So it was the 2002 Winter Games in Salt Lake City. After 9/11, nobody was sure if we were even going to have a games. It's interesting that Mitt Romney came along to sort of save the Salt Lake City Games from a bunch of corruption that had happened the years before. He was going to clean it up, and he was actually doing that when everything sort of paused in a dramatic fashion, certainly with 9/11. So we weren't even sure we were going to have it. And we kept having these story meetings, and we kept talking to each other about how we thought, wow, the fans are going to be too afraid to attend, the security is going to be too tight, nobody's even going to come to these games, there's going to be this fear throughout every arena. We wrote a lot of those stories. And the one thing I remember from that is that, besides being invited to Mitt Romney's house, which was kind of interesting, that's another story to tell one day, but he's somebody who did feel like he was the savior of those games. And he was upbeat about the fact that he believed it was going to be successful no matter what had happened in the biggest trauma in our history at that time, direct trauma, that it still was going to be okay, people would still come. And I remember going to that dinner thinking Mitt was crazy, right? People are going to be afraid. And the interesting thing was, because Mitt was living in Salt Lake City, and because he was sort of listening to what was going on the ground, he actually did know more than we did. And the media wrote, and I can tell you, I wrote a couple of them, a ton of stories leading up to the games, basically predicting how the games would not make it, how the games would suffer from small crowds, how people would be less enthusiastic because they didn't want to be too patriotic, because what did that mean, and who was around them, and be afraid of the person next to them from all these different countries that were coming in. And so it was something where you realize that all of our thinking was from our own point of view, because we were in New York where it happened. And so our own sort of point of view actually tainted our ability to tell the right story. The right story and the right way of doing it would have been to go out and talk to people and to really take the pulse of what was going on in communities, and not really write it from our perspective, being so close to 9/11 at the New York Times. It did color our view of what was going to happen. So we sort of projected our own bias, our own fears into our own writing, and it really did steer the coverage. So while journalists are really good at being compartmentalizing and to try to tell the truth and tell the story, you can't help sometimes but be colored by your own issues, right? But we didn't have the tool back then to really go out and survey anybody in real time. We didn't really have the tool to go do that. The only tool you had back then is really the most important tool you'll still have now, which is curiosity. Curiosity is the best thing you can have as a journalist. It's the best thing you have as a videographer, as a communications expert, is the curiosity. And that's what polling is. Polling is curiosity. Polling is asking those questions over and over again so that you're not going by just your gut. You're not going by what the group think is. You're not going to the same sources over and over again. I can't tell you how many in the sports world and political world, the reporters go to the same sources all the time, so you're going to get the same stories from the same point of view very often. But when you get outside the bubble, good things happen. And I think some of the more important stories I got to cover as a journalist were because I was able to get outside the bubble. The Alex Rodriguez story happened. We discovered that he was a steroid user in baseball because we were really curious about what we were hearing in places other than New York and in places other than the media circle. Lance Armstrong, same thing. We were very curious about why it is that we were hearing all this other stuff, not in the media, where the media was sort of bought in on the whole idea that, he was a saint. He was going to save sport. So curiosity is still the best tool you can have. But if you can put curiosity with the information and with what you guys are telling us, at the Tylt, where we're just bringing in question after question, whether it's about, sometimes it's about the Kardashians, there's no lie about that. Sometimes it's about politics and climate change. So we cover about everything. We send out a dozen questions a day, and we are constantly bringing in that information. So I think the most important part now is that we're all in that information world. And so we're on Twitter, we're out there sending out polls through Twitter, so we see a lot of what's going on out there. The one thing that's kind of become a revelation to me and to journalists everywhere is that the new bubble is not the groupthink in the office of people sitting around a news table deciding what the story is that day. The new groupthink, and I think this is more disturbing to me, is Twitter. So often when you go on to Twitter, I think that, I don't know if you guys believe this, but I see it, and I think that sometimes journalists are kind of performing for each other, that they're out there retweeting stuff because they're trying to get an in-kind retweet back, and then it becomes a sort of like death spiral of people looking to each other to almost get their news judgment through Twitter. More than any editor, you see people and hear journalists talk about what was on Twitter, and Twitter is a very useful tool. And it's not to say that journalists shouldn't be on Twitter, but when journalists allow Twitter to curate their news judgment, that's the new bubble that we're in, right? If the bubble before Twitter was the newsroom where nobody got outside the newsroom and started talking to people, and then a lot of the formulation was, you know what, this is what my gut says, so I'm gonna write that. The new bubble is this. The new bubble is Twitter becoming the editor and designing and curating sometimes the news coverage. And that's kind of scary because you hope it's the other way around. And so that's why I think it's really important, that we are trying to get back the credibility by just asking the question to you guys, right? We already know that it's under threat. We already know what people think about the media. We already know what Donald Trump says about fake news. We already know that people are always trying to undermine anything in the news with, trolling or throwing shade or anything like that through Twitter. So the credibility is already under threat. So what do we do? How do we get that back? And I think the one thing that I love that the Tylt does, and that what I'm so proud to be a part of, is that we ask questions so we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. One of the questions we asked recently was, should we stop talking about politicians' electability? At the very same day that we wrote that, you could look around the internet and you could see dozens of stories talking about how likable somebody is. And this goes back to when George Bush was first elected, about the beer. Do I want to have a beer with him? What we've found when you talk to young people, they're not interested in having a beer with them, although some of the Bernie bros might be, I don't know. But you're really interested in what is going on the ground. And recently, our young journalists did their own little road trip to Iowa. And they stopped in about 8 cities along the way. And they talked to people who are just like you about things that they care about. Sometimes they talk about college debt. Sometimes they talked about fear of climate. Climate change anxiety was pretty rampant throughout the trip. So all while the mainstream media was covering, and a lot of my friends that are still working there, were covering the horse race of what was going on between Biden and Warden and Buttigieg and everybody else that was kind of going full blast into Iowa. Our group was like on the road talking to people who looked just like you, asking them what they cared about, and in Akron what they cared about, and in places like, I think it was like Onary, Pennsylvania, some crazy little place I've never even heard of, that they were stopping in and talking to people along the way, and they were finding out as they went something kind of amazing, in that while people were projecting Biden to do pretty well in Iowa, maybe not to win it, but to do pretty well, our little group was out there hearing people talk about how there was no sort of like Biden love out there. There was nobody talking about Biden. So in a sense, by being on the ground and talking to people, they knew what was going to happen in the Iowa caucus before the mainstream media did. They were literally in our van going across the country and going into Iowa, discovering that he was absolutely toast in Iowa because they were hearing it on the ground, because they were talking to people. So in a sense, it's the better way to do journalism. It's a better way because you're putting together the things that you're asking people with the resources you have to write the story itself. So what I love about what we do is that we try not to repeat the same mistakes. And 2016 was full of a lot of mistakes. And I think so often polling gets a bad name from 2016. I'll never know, maybe we'll never know exactly why some polls knocked Quinnipiac, which was actually accurate, were so far off in 2016. Maybe there was a mischief going on with the voting. We'll probably never know. But polling does talk to people. It talks to people in such a different way than journalists get to. And right now, when I look out there and I see the latest Quinnipiac poll having just about 4, 5, 6 candidates beating Trump by 5, 6, 7 to 10 points, I'm wondering, where is the story in that? Why is nobody writing about that? And they continue to go to the same diners, talking to the same people about the same thing, and sometimes the same people are appearing over and over in stories. It's like, what is going on that they can't look outside themselves and outside the same bubble and the groupthink and the Twitter to go out there and find the good story? So my challenge to you guys is to listen, to stay with that biggest tool, which is curiosity, and really listen to your gut. That certainly helped me along my career, whether it was chasing down Alex Rodriguez or Lance Armstrong, or going through Indian reservations for 6 weeks and talking to people about how they felt. At least I was outside the bubble, and I think that's the key thing, is that no matter what time you come through journalism, to step outside of it. Right now it's digital. So right now there's a way to step outside of it, and that's by asking questions. So that's what we do. And that's why we believe that every vote, every single vote that we get, is that voice that tells the story, right? So if you're telling us what your anxiety is, we should be out there doing it. In fact, that's what we do. We have a reporter who is doing a 3-part series on climate change, but not from the sort of the safe distance of talking to experts, but our reporter, Jessie Blazer, basically embedded herself for going now on 5 months with the Friday for Freedoms group, and also XR, to go into those groups who were fighting the fight on the ground, being in their organizational meetings, talking to people who were sometimes 16, 17, 18, but often 20, 25, 26, about what they were doing and what their voice meant, and to get inside their head and to talk to a young man who was willing to glue himself with his feet with super glue onto a boat in Times Square for an XR protest, and to get his story. Why did he do it? What is the fear that he has? And I think by drilling down and doing those stories and being embedded in the culture and going for the sort of the best storytelling device is often just to be in front of the person who has the story to tell. By continuing to do that, you're kind of marrying the sort of the old school version with the new school version. And I think the new school version is very much about voting and polling and listening to it. And when Quinnipiac has a poll that is as distinct as the one that's going out right now, there should be people asking about why is it that you can look at the media and they're all in on one way to write the story, and yet information is right in front of them on where the divides are, where the hope is. And sometimes there is hope that no one's writing about that side of it because no one's listening. So to me, it's like about listening. And if I can do anything in my role at the Tylt, it is to encourage the young journalists, creators, videographers to go out there and listen and to be part of the story in that way and not part of the story by writing from their own point of view all the time. So that's basically what I do and what I preach the gospel of. And so I'm here to help you guys think about your career. Most of you are in communications, journalism. Raise a hand. Any of you in sports journalism? Good for you. One day. ESPN's just right down the street, right? So of those who are in communications journalism, do you think about a career in digital publications, or are you thinking about it in film? How many people think digital publications? Would that be, when you think about digital publications, do you think HuffPo or do you think something else? Like HuffPo? The Atlantic? Like that's digital now too. Everything seems to be digital now. So yeah, any questions you guys have, there are 2 microphones, here. Yes, you can ask about Alex Rodriguez if you want to, or about any of the other crazy stories I've been involved with over the years, which has been a really great ride. Sports was really great. I mean, sports prepared me for just about every other kind of journalism you can imagine.
Selena, let me start. I have a question. The Tylt is owned by
Advance. Yeah, the Newhouse family,
Advance Local.
Yep.
And Advance owns a bunch of newspapers all over the country.
Yes.
How is what you're doing at the Tylt, how is that going to manifest itself into what Advance is doing at its newspaper, let's say in Syracuse, New York? Is that how it's working?
Mm-hmm.
This experiment with the Tylt is feeding how other media, other newspapers in the company are going to be operating going forward?
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing about what Advanced Publications, which is owned by the Newhouse family, is doing is that we're in a group called the Alpha Group, right? We're in this sort of incubator group that is trying new things in journalism. There's also other groups that are doing other things with technology in the same group that we are. So what we do is we're trying the new paradigm out. We're sort of kicking the tires on it. And what we found is that very often, the way that our polls go out is really through contextualized writing. Very often, the poll is sitting in the middle of a story. If you go to our site, very often if you click on a story with a poll in it, there's a story telling you what both sides are saying about this, and then there's the answer. Well, very often, if you are in Cleveland and you're reading the Cleveland Plain Dealer online, you will see that exact story go out and appear in their publication. So we're syndicated throughout all of the newspaper organizations under Advance Local, whether it's the Oregonian, whether it's the New York Star Ledger, or whether it's the Cleveland Plain Dealer. So all of our stories go out in syndication. So very often you'll see the poll that we put online will be a poll that's sitting in alabama.com in Birmingham, Alabama. So we are sort of viewed as something that they are trying throughout all of their newspapers to create engagement, but also to gather in real time what sentiment is out there as well. So we try to make sure that even though our audience is usually 18 to 34, that we are also taking into perspectives that are coming through newspapers where an audience is sometimes very much older.
Okay. And then second question before I open it up. The Quinnipiac poll is very meticulous about its methods and trying to keep its margin of error as low as possible.
Right.
How do you ensure that the polls that you guys are doing are accurate in terms of public perception?
Yeah, we have
Tell me a little bit about the algorithm too.
Right. So we do things a little differently. We don't use landlines. Nothing wrong with that. And we just decided that for this incubator project, the algorithm, which is called Signal, is very much able to trace votes that go wherever you are. If you're on Facebook, you'll probably see one of our polls. If you are on Twitter, you'll see one of our polls. And they're very often tied to a hashtag, which we can trace wherever it goes. So when people retweet and other people vote on it, we can trace that as well. So I think that what we do that's different than what Quinnipiac does, that's different than what Pew or Gallup does, is that we're not looking for specific margins of error on a specific question, as much as what we're looking at is like sentiment and passion. Like, what is the sentiment analysis that we can measure by gathering all this information? Recently, we had a poll that went up just about bands of the decades. Like, are you One Dimension? Are you BTS? Things I didn't know much about till I started working there, but I've become a BTS fan. The fact that you can put out a poll and that 16 million votes came in on that poll, and you can imagine the amount of insight and sentiment you can get. Certainly you can look at things like, how did the gender break down? Obviously a lot of girls voted on that poll. Where were they? Well, they were all over the world. We can track votes all over the world. But what does it mean? And it means, in a big way, by just gathering the sentiment and passion of it, is that fandoms are incredibly powerful. They're so powerful that they can generate 16 million votes in 3 weeks. They're so powerful when you start looking at it in the bigger picture of it, that very often the stars themselves are at the mercy of their own fandoms. I'm not going to be in Beyonce's head, but there are times when you wonder if she worries about her fans so much that it stops her from saying certain things publicly. There was an incident at a Lakers game last year where one of the owners for the Lakers leaned over and talked to Jay-Z, and it became a big deal online. Like, who's messing with Beyonce's husband in front of her? Well, it was nothing, of course. But did Beyonce come out and say much about it? No, because the Beehive was going crazy about it. And they were generating a lot of attention, a lot of sort of circulatory celebrity was going around the internet, and Beyonce didn't say anything. Does she want to be on the wrong side of her fandom? So in a sense, you can say, oh, you know, One Direction versus BTS, that's going to draw a lot of heat. But the bigger picture is how much power these fandoms have. So if we can take something like that and start to look at the psychology of fandom by all the information that we receive from that, that is a story that can be told differently. So that's how we sort of take in more of a sentiment passion analysis than we do a per vote, per person analysis. We want to see where the heat is. We want to see where the heat is coming from. And then we want to try to parse that and find out what the story is. It's a little different.
Questions? There's a mic here, there's a mic over there.
Don't be
Anybody
shy.
have a question?
Don't be shy.
Come up to the mic.
You can do it.
And if you come up to the mic, I need to know who One Direction and BTS is.
I know.
Because I have no clue what
I'm here to help. I'm really here to help, Chris, is what I'm here to do. There's a lot of things. We listen to a lot of Lizzo in the office. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to my question. I like to ask questions. So.
Yeah.
That's why you're in school, right?
Alright, so my question. Alright, first I want to say thank you for giving us a voice, right? Like, I think the interactiveness of Tylt is very insightful and like some foresight into like what's to come in terms of journalism. So like, especially I think our generation has a lot of good ideas and like a lot of big media doesn't really pay attention to us that much. So, and I guess my question is, so you mentioned you were working at the Star Tribune in Minnesota. and you said you're really into sports. I just wondered if you
Notice that he's wearing a Vikings hat.
I see it.
Yeah.
I've spotted once in a
I don't
while.
know if you covered the Minnesota Vikings at all.
I did. You know, sometimes I wonder if I find scandal or it finds me. Probably both. When I was covering the Vikings, they went through quite a history. It was when Warren Moon was the quarterback. Remember that? So it was in the early 90s, early to mid 90s. And when I was covering the Vikings, they seemed to be sort of like a crazy calamity of stuff going on. I remember knocking on the door of one player and to talk to his wife about an incident that had happened at a restaurant. And when the wife opened the door, I said, "Oh, are you, I think his name was Fernando's wife," and she says, "I'm one of them." And I'm like, okay, so this story got a little strange. So it was a weird time. It turned out that he indeed was married to two people at one time, which in Minnesota, not legal. So that became a story in itself. And then while I was there, Warren Moon had a domestic violence situation. And while I was there, we did an investigative story. Dennis Green was the coach when I was covering the team. And we did an investigative story. And it turned out that he had some issues when he was the coach at Stanford involving some of the women who worked there. So it seemed like there was just craziness all the time with the Vikings when I was there. But they kept winning, I will say that. They didn't care. They had an amazing coaching staff. Tony Dungy was the defensive coordinator when I was there. But as far as sort of like living in Minneapolis and covering the team, they were great guys. I mean, Chris Carter was really fun to cover. We had John Randall was really fun to cover. So as much scandal and craziness that was going on back then, it was a fun team to cover. It was the days where they played in the old Metrodome. So I don't know if you guys ever know anything about the Metrodome, but it really was just a big bubble with a ton of air inside. So when you came in and out of a door, you literally got sucked into another vortex in space because the suction power of that air. You've been through, right? You've been there? You're too young.
I was a little young.
Before your time.
Yeah, before my time. I'm hoping they would make it to US Bank.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful stadium. Better than what?
The snow popular.
You had the snow sitting on the roof, and you're not sure if it's going to come down on you. Yeah, so they've upgraded. So but the Vikings, yeah, I mean, I think they're a great organization, though. I certainly was there during a crazy time, but it was a fantastic organization to cover. Yeah. You bet. You bet. Anybody else?
I'm a little short, so
No.
you might not hear me. So my name's Lee, and I was curious if you have a tool or a device that you use to monitor, how do I say this? The intake of your polls, and if you're able to analyze the demographics of the audiences you're reaching, and if you do, how to use that information to later sort of hit the gray areas and boost audience engagement where you're not reaching.
Right. The way that we measure everything is really in real time. Right now, if I had my computer in front of me, I could pull up our dashboard, right? And it would really be tied to the hashtags that go with every single poll that we have are sort of sitting on this dashboard. And then all the columns next to that go through whether it's Facebook or whether it's Twitter or whether it's a manual vote where somebody comes into the site itself to vote. All that sort of comes up on, and retweets and everything else, and likes and all sorts of bells and whistles kind of flash onto the screen. So when we were doing the bands of the decade, which was this craziness, it was just like watching like pinball, just boom, 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 boom. So you're watching all this insight. So those are just the votes themselves, right? So then we have certainly filters built in where we filter out bots, we filter out abusive voting and all those kind of things to really distill it down to a really good quantifiable measurement. And then we have other tools that are over my pay grade, the developers make, that look inside the numbers themselves. So yeah, we can see certainly gender breakdown, you can see certainly geographical breakdown, but you can also sort of trace like affinity groups, you know? Like if we have a poll and it's about the NCAA and whether athletes should be paid or not, you can look into a poll like that, which we got a lot of votes on, and talk about, okay, of the guys that voted, what are the affinity groups? Do they like football the most? Do they like baseball the most? And if they do like baseball or football, do they like fast casual food and all that kind of stuff? So you can kind of look in and sort of see a little bit of who votes where and why and what they like, those kind of things. So when we're looking at, something, whether it's behavior or whether it's just an action itself, you can kind of see where things are happening, like with climate change, for example. It's interesting to look at the geographical breakdown of what our climate change polling has said. We do everything. We ask about plastic straws, we ask about zero waste, could you live as a vegan, all those kind of things that we ask all the time. But if you take all that collection, you start saying, okay, where is all this coming from? Where is the most anxiety? And you can see, okay, well, some of the top cities are sort of what you would expect. New York, LA, things like that. But then you start seeing a ton of Florida cities, because that's where it's happening now, right? They're screwed now, Florida, my old state, completely going down. So if climate change is coming, it's coming there, and that's where you actually see a lot of anxiety. You see Orlando, Florida, kind of bubbling up into the top 10 of anxiety areas that they're feeling the effects of climate change. And you're seeing Miami, and you're seeing St. Petersburg, and all these places where it's actually happening now, where they're having king tides come in, and where people in Key West who used to live on 2-foot stilts are now raising their houses to 8-foot stilts, because it's happening all the time. So in a sense, when you start looking at it and you start diving deeper into the analysis, as you said, you can kind of peel all the layers back, and you start seeing, like, where is the anxiety really happening? So if I'm a news editor with resources and I want to find out what's happening in Florida, it'd be great to send a team to Florida and to find out on the ground what people are doing, how they feel, and what is going down in Florida, more than I would want to send somebody somewhere else where maybe the anxiety wasn't registering as high. So that's kind of how we do it. I'm not smart enough to know how the algorithm works. Forget that. But the other stuff I got. Oh, back.
So I figure I will probably never get a poll of yours because I'm not your demographic.
You could go online and
I
time.
could. But I was just reading online your poll on the Impossible Burger versus red meat.
Yes.
Now, how does Tylt send the poll out to the people that it wants to reach? I mean, I don't know if anyone in the room has ever gotten a poll, or how do you reach your audiences so that they can do the question?
Right. So we have several methods. Certainly, we have our natural followers. We have people who, I think it's about 1.5 million, across social media. So we have our natural followers that are there. As I said a little bit earlier, sort of our syndication through all the advanced local, newspapers that are there that also receive the polling through the newspapers and through their online, obviously, on that way. And then we also have a bit of paid media. We have the ability to go to people that are not naturally part of our audience, that are part of our audience in sort of affinity groups like ages and things like that. We have the ability to have paid media where we are able to place those polls in different areas, around the internet, so that we can be where you are. It may be Facebook, it may be Twitter, or it may be some other online method through another newspaper that you're getting it, but we're circulating as much as possible. And certainly we have the ability to send that signal out throughout the internet. And I think the cool thing is when somebody shares it, it goes to another level, right? So when people share it, they naturally are getting that to a different audience that maybe we didn't target, or maybe we didn't see, or maybe we didn't get to. So the ability to share the polls themselves sort of amplify the voices that we get back. Because very often, whether it's bands of the decades, or whether it was sort of the fight from Lady Gaga and Katy Perry at the end when they were getting 500 and 1 million and 2 million votes coming in on those two, because people were sharing it throughout the internet, we were able to see and amplify that poll throughout the internet. So a lot of it is, when we go to extensive numbers like that, it's because people shared it. So a lot of it counts on you. If you share it, more people get it. Anything else? Yep. Hi.
I don't know if you can hear me. I have a couple very different questions.
Sure.
I'm at the very end of your target audience at 34. I worked in a newspaper, now I work for the government. And I work as a media liaison. So we see how the media has changed. We recently saw on a very large scale really poor journalism in the state and national with the court case that we've been seeing. And I was wondering if there's any way to get journalism to slow down to protect itself from that bad journalism that seems to be really amplified by social media.
Was it a specific court case that's active now, or?
It's no longer active. The defendant killed himself.
Okay.
And it was reported
Was
that
it the domestic issue?
Yeah. It was reported that he was dead 2 days before he was dead.
The New York Post reported that he was dead, and several other publications tweeted out that he had died.
WFSB said he was dead.
Do they think that precipitate, or like, was it a force behind the suicide? Was it the one, he was in the garage?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay,
Yes.
okay.
He had lost consciousness, he had lost the pulse, and so immediately the story went out that he was dead. He
So-
survived, and there were very few local media who did not jump on that bandwagon, who could say that their reporting was correct.
It reminds me a little bit of what we just saw with Kobe Bryant and some of the immediate reactions to that. I think some of the earliest tweets where his whole family died, in the helicopter crash. Certainly it was tragic enough as it ended up being. But do you think that this started with a tweet, or did it start another way in this respect, in the case you're talking about?
No, I think it started with, I know the Harvard Current was the first that we had heard that they had put a headline, and that was on their online media.
Okay, so they got it wrong.
They got it wrong. And then everybody else, oh, the Current's reporting it, we need to report it as well, because we can't be left behind.
Right. So there's a tragic contagion, right, that happens because now, since it is online, it's not a headline in the paper that came out and you had time to change it before confirmation. I think that there's a contagion now that never existed before. And because of the virality of everything, it's like there's no thought process. Like you said, no one's slowing down to say, wait a minute, is that true? Should we be right before we're first, right? And I think that because of the contagion effect, people get swept up in it so quickly. Because not to be in on the no, even if the no is wrong, is to lose valuable clicks in what's left of the news media. I think that because the news media has been so gutted, and I'm sure the Hartford Courant has suffered like a lot of newspapers have suffered, that you're losing a lot of those frontline journalists who might have been a gatekeeper on something like that. Because you see it even at places like the New York Times where they have gutted their editing staff. So a lot of mistakes get through. And they're basically using you to crowdsource their errors, in a sense. It's almost now, and I think even slowing down is certainly one way to start to prevent this a little bit, but also just having gatekeepers in key roles in local media is so essential. And I think what you're seeing now is the corrosive effect of all the layoffs, the corrosive effect of digital taking over and people losing common sense, the corrosive effect of very often now hedge funders owning newspapers and owning digital outlets and making decisions that are not good for news itself. But in that case, not knowing specifically who did what and where the mistake was made, my guess is that if they'd had enough gatekeepers asking the question and fact-checking the issue itself, then you would never have had that in the first place. So when you start to lose editors, which is what has gone first in so many newsrooms, the editors have gone first. When you don't have somebody to sit there and say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Have we checked this twice? You know, it's like, have we done enough due diligence? This is a big deal to say someone's dead. Have we done the due diligence? Did we go back and recheck our sources? Who said what when? Did we have 3 people? In the old days, you needed 3 people to do anything, right? You needed 3 people to ask for water. You needed 3 people for everything back in the old days because you had to have it checked 3 times. Now it's like maybe once and you're good. So my guess is that because everything got so gutted, that the contagion effect took over when one person got it wrong. And the next thing you know, everybody got it wrong.
So my second question is, as someone who works for the government and is in control of our very limited social media, how does a government agency who is very conservative use polling and social media to engage with the people we come in contact with?
Well, I would think from your point of view, you want to trust the poll, right? You want to trust the information that you're pushing out there to the people who are coming to the government for answers, right? So if you're a government agency, and I don't know which agency you would be in or which department you would be in, but a lot of government on the federal level has also been gutted, right? There have been a lot of cutbacks, especially the EPA and other agencies that also have sort of stripped themselves of some of the gatekeepers that they need to. So the first thing is to trust your information. Like you just said, if a prominent newspaper is putting something out, you think you can trust it, but now you got to ask yourself, should we pause for a second before we receive that information? So from a government standpoint, I would say trust the survey, trust the poll. If you have that credibility factor that you believe in, then you can use that information to relate to the public. But if you don't trust something, it's almost like you have to sort of like be eyes wide open. If it looks weird and looks strange, you probably shouldn't use it, But use our stuff. It's all right. No, it's true. It's like you have to sort of like be vigilant for your own purposes when you're in the government, I'm sure. Anybody else?
We have time for maybe one more question. Anybody wants to ask about A-Rod?
I'll say he's doing pretty well. He's got J-Lo, he's doing great things. He's got a good gig with ESPN, so I think he ended up doing okay after everything settled down.
All right, Selena, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.